All right, so I'm live here, episode 7 of 52 weeks of AWS. And what's nice about 52 weeks of AWS this week is I'm going to just relax a little bit and not do anything too crazy and just cover some of the services that are available with AWS. And so, in terms of, where we would start and how we would do things here, I'm going to first start off with just talking a little bit about, some of the things that are available on the AWS platform and some of the different deployment targets. I think that's probably the biggest thing to think about. And then, where are the different services that I would care about in terms of, deploying, what are the different, trade-offs that I would want to make. We covered the AWS Cloud Practitioner material before, and that really gives us a foundation for AWS. But what if I want to go through and, just get started building something? Like, where do I start? What are the different services that I can play around with? And I would say to start with, just from a high level, some of the services to consider for AWS would be the Lambda environment. It's probably the easiest possible way to build something useful. Another one that's pretty cool is the step functions, because step functions allow you to orchestrate jobs and build state machines. And then once you're done, really playing around with those things, then I would say the next step after that would be, maybe the terminal could be a good place to experiment, invoke some services like AWS Comprehend or Recognition. And then also you could go through and potentially build PaaS services. And so the real PaaS-based services to be aware of would be AWS Elastic Beanstalk and AWS App Runner. Those are probably the two high-level services. So I think that's a good place to start today. Is I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to go through and start to build some code examples using those services and just see where we get and play around a little bit. So to start off with, I'm going to share my screen here, and I will start off with the AWS console here. So really this is the beginning. If you're building things on AWS, you want to start with the AWS console. And in particular, what's nice about the AWS console is that I can, if I want to, the shortest path between 2 points is a straight line. You want to do something on AWS, get started with it. Cloud Shell is a pretty decent environment to invoke things. Because it's going to take a little bit of time to launch Cloud Shell, what I'll do is I'll open up in another tab the console again, and I'm going to click on Lambda. And so what's nice about Lambda is that it is probably the most whiz-bang thing you could do in all of AWS. Many people like it because you don't have to worry about runtimes. And some of the things to be aware of with Lambda is that they support many different languages. So I'm going to go ahead and create a function in AWS Lambda. There's a bunch of different ways to create a function. You can author from scratch. You can use a blueprint. You can use a container image to deploy your function. And you can also browse examples. Now, the container image is kind of a cool one because it allows you to, for example, browse images that are in your Amazon container registry. So if we go here and we browse, I could go through here and find some previous image and just deploy that image. And that is actually pretty nice in terms of somebody who has embraced containers. There's also author from scratch here, which is, start with a hello world example. And in particular, I think Python is probably the best one. And one of the ones that I like to build is an add function. And so I'm going to go through here and say add, Python. And for runtime, let's just take a look at some of the different runtimes that are available. We've got .NET Core 3.1 or PowerShell. And this is actually pretty compelling because, in the future, I'm sure there'll be support for the latest versions of .NET. But what's also nice is you could build things in PowerShell. Many people are big fans of Go. I know an AWS company, Twitch, uses Go heavily. There's Java, which is obviously still a very popular language. There's Node.js, and there's Python 3.9, Ruby 2.7. So we've got a ton of different choices here in the AWS Lambda environment. So the odds are If you're a developer already, you probably know one of these languages, and then you can even go through other supported languages and scroll through different, things like custom runtimes, for example, Bootstrap, your own Amazon Linux 1 or 2 environment. I'm going to pick Python 3.9. And also notice what's kind of cool here is that we could pick either x86 or ARM. Now, why would you want to switch between ARM? So if you're not using third-party libraries, you could save a lot of money by using ARM. And so I'm going to go ahead and pick ARM because I'm going to build something really simple. And then the other thing to be aware of with AWS Lambda is that the permissions. So AWS Lambda, if I did want to call some service, for example, AWS Comprehend to do sentiment analysis or entity extraction, I would actually go through here and I would change the default execution role and I would use an existing role. So that role would need to have the ability to invoke something on my behalf. In this case, though, I'm going to just create a new role with basic permissions because I'm just building something very simple. Now, if I go through here and I create a function, the next thing to be aware of is you'll be put into an interactive prompt where you can build out things inside of AWS Lambda. And again, my opinion is that this is probably the best way to learn AWS. If you have never used it before, I think AWS Lambda is probably one of the better ways to build things out and learn the platform. And a couple of things I'm going to point out about the Lambda console. One of the things that you'll see is there's a trigger and a destination. And what's nice about this is that you can actually have an event-based workflow. So why would you want a trigger? One of the, canonical use cases for a trigger would be that I could either talk to an API gateway, so this would be a web service, or I could talk to maybe the S3 bucket or a Dynamo database or something like that and listen to an event. So in the case of S3, what's nice about S3 is a very good example would be, let's say you're building a social network and your social network accepts, posts from users. Well, the user could take a screenshot or whatever it is, something from their phone. They put it into S3. You have a Lambda. It's listening. It does a bunch of things to that image, and then it, puts it into the database. So that kind of event-based workflow is really nice because you can actually have S3 do the heavy lifting and then the Lambda just respond to the events. In our case, I'm not going to build a trigger. I'm just going to go right into the code here. And when you scroll down, there is a code, a test, a monitor, configuration, alias, version. These are all tabs that are available. But to start with, what we can do is just play around with this code source here, and I can actually delete the first line of code, go through here and implement something. And the main thing to be aware of with a Lambda function is that this Lambda handler signature in Python is the work that's going to be done, and then event is what's passed in from some kind of an event. And this is something that could be the console, it could be S3, it could be whatever, and it's going to be a JSON payload. And the context is the environment it's running in. Really, we only care about the event. And what I could do is put a print statement at the very beginning, use the F strings in Python, and go through here and say something like this, event is, and then put in, event, something like this. And what's nice about Python F strings is they take the curly brackets and they will just swap out the results of a variable that you set inside of an F string statement. And now, if I wanted to build a very simple, add function, what I could do is I could just say my, payload, and just assign a variable called payload is equal to event, and then whatever is I'm gonna put into the event. Potentially, it would be, it would be a maybe an X and a Y. So let's actually change this around, and I'll have an X is equal to an event, and inside of here we'll say X, and then we'll do a Y is equal to event Y. And so we can have a JSON payload that has an X and a Y inside of it. And then I would just go through here and I would say, maybe make it an int as well. So I could do, int for both of these. And then I could go through here and say even a print statement. I always think it's a good idea in Lambda functions to print out what's happening. And I could say, these are my inputs, and then put in a curly bracket X, and then a Y with a curly bracket. And this will just keep track of the two things that I parsed. And then I would just return back the results. So I can say return, X plus Y. Now, once I've built out a Lambda function, what I can do is I can actually deploy it. This pushes that change live. And then I need to build out a test function. So I would need to go click on the test button at the top and go through here, and we'll just use the Hello World template to stay with. Now, there are other templates that you can use. For example, if I wanted to go through here and look at other services and look at the payloads, they're very complex, some of these payloads. But this is how I would understand how to write something that would listen to an event. In our case, though, we care about the Hello World examples. And so what I would want to do is, in fact, just go to test here, go down to, in fact, I could just delete everything, and we could just say template would be Hello World, most common, and I'll call this one 2 plus 2, and then I would just say for one of the keys it would be X, and then we could make that key X1, and then we would say, Y2, something like that. And then I could just go through here and then send this payload into our Lambda. So I'll format the JSON, clean it up a little bit, say create, and then once I click test, it'll go through here and it says 2 plus 2. And actually, in our case, though, I think we didn't do 2 plus 2. we did 2 and 1, so I'll change it to 2 plus 2. And then we'll go through here and format it and save. So pretty straightforward, actually, to go through here and test this out. You can see that all I needed to do was put the signature in that says Lambda handler. The event is the payload that comes in from something, and I print out this event. I then set an X, I set a Y, and then I return back the result of it. So really a powerful way to work is to use AWS Lambda. And it's really easy if you get started with it from the console. Now, another thing you can do with the AWS Lambda here is that we could also call it from potentially a step function. And so one of the things that we could do is we could go over to our step function interface here. And inside of AWS, I go to the top here, I go for search, and I say step functions. Here we go. We put in step functions. And this is where I would go and I would orchestrate something. And what I would do is I would click on create state machine. And I could visually design a state machine. And what's nice about it is that it gives me a kind of a drag and drop interface here. And so in the design interface here, I could just drag a Lambda function. And what's nice about this Lambda function is that all I need to do is do some kind of invocation to it. So I need to just pick what the Lambda function is that I'm going to call. So there's a section called function name, the function to invoke. I just picked the one that I just added, which was add Python. And now it shows up and we can see here, I can play around with it. And really, if you want to just do something very, very simple, you could just start with one simple Lambda function and it'll create a big JSON payload for you to play around with it, and you want to do more advanced stuff. If you wanted to chain things together, it's pretty easy to chain things together, but I'm just going to keep this very simple state machine here, and we'll call this basically add machine, and then we'll leave everything going here. And then once I've got it created, I would click on start execution. So with a step function, in our case, because we have a Lambda in the middle, I'm just going to click start execution, and then it comes up when you start an execution. It'll give you a UID, right? So basically a UUID. So like a unique user ID will just be auto-generated, and then I need to put something in. So it's kind of similar to invoking Lambda. In this case, though, we're putting it inside this machine. And so I would do the same thing. I would just go through here and say, basically we'll do an X, and then we would do, we'll do 4, and then we'll do a Y, and then we'll make the Y be equal to 8. And then I can say start execution. And then what it'll do is it'll send that payload into my Lambda function that we had here. Now what's neat is I can look and introspect the JSON payload that gets sent into my function, which is pretty awesome. And then I can actually look at what the result is, and look, there we go. We see that it's 12. So the input was 4 and 8, and the output is 12. And again, I could chain more and more complex things together if I wanted to. One of the things to be aware of would be that I would want to have my Lambda function return JSON payloads so that it's easy to chain together multiple Lambda functions. But we could do lots of complex things between both AWS Lambda and step functions. So again, that's probably the first place I would start if you're playing around with Python. Start with a AWS Lambda and then go into a step function, maybe play around. Now, what's the next thing that might be a good thing to play around with? Well, now that we've done a little bit with Lambda, I would say just tweaking things a little bit from the command line. So the AWS command line has the S3 capability right off the bat, which is the bucket storage or object storage. And if I want to type in AWS S3 ls, it'll just list through my bucket. So it's kind of a good hello world as list your buckets, right? Now, what if I wanted to do something a little more sophisticated? Well, I do have an example here that I could grab up, and I have the comprehend service that I had invoked earlier. And so this is a good example here. If I paste this in, you can see that AWS comprehend, I use the NLP service, and what I do is I say detect the sentiment, and I do -- language code equals English. So I want to send in a payload, -- text equals I love C#, and we go through here and we can go ahead and invoke it. So all services in AWS work this way. Everything from Lambda to comprehend to SageMaker, whatever it is you want to call, it's the AWS command, the name of the service, and then the component of that service. So again, a very simple service to play around with to get started with AWS. Let's say you're done playing with that and you want to keep going to the next thing to learn AWS a little bit more. What would you want to do? Well, let's draw this out. So let's go to, I'm going to draw things up into a sketch pad for a second and just talk a little bit about some of the trade-offs of the different services that are available on AWS. So far we've covered the AWS Lambda. So really for lightweight things here, if you just want to play around with lightweight services, I think Lambda is not bad, right? Let's actually make this pencil a little bit thicker. It's not bad, AWS Lambda, because it's a function, right? So why would you use Lambda? You want to do event-driven programming, and you want something that's we'll call this event-driven. And we also don't care about building complex things. We just care about something that's maybe 20, 30 lines of code in multiple languages too, like C#, PowerShell, Python, Go. Most languages are going to be really, really tiny, and so you would build out microservices. That's a good place to start. But then what if I want to build out experiments and try out SDKs? Well, this is where the Cloud Shell environment would come into play. And this would be you would just invoke things, right? You go through and invoke, some kind of an SDK. This is a good place to play around with things, and so what if I wanted to do more than just Lambda or Cloud Shell? What else could I play around with? Well, AWS App Runner, which we'll get to in a second, is probably another good spot to play around with things. And then we also have the AWS Beanstalk. And so these are probably the main services that are worth playing around with. Why would you use App Runner? This would be a microservice as well, but it's even simpler in some sense than AWS Lambda, especially if you're going to build a HTTP service. It's probably the sweet spot for the time you would take. Beanstalk is pretty cool because it manages more of a legacy type app with a load balancer and all this stuff for you. And so, Beanstalk would be more of a classic PaaS or platform as a service. And I would say if we call Lambda number 1, Cloud Shell would be number 2, App Runner would be number 3, Beanstalk would be 4. What's left? Well, we have EKS and ECS and ECR. These are all the container-based services on AWS. EKS stands for Elastic Kubernetes Service. ECS stands for Elastic Container Service. And then ECR stands for Elastic Container Registry. So you also can build things inside of these services. And in particular, ECS has Fargate, and that's a very popular container as a service offering. Okay, so we've got these all sketched out here. So how do we go forward here and play around with more of these services? Well, let's go back now to App Runner, and let's take a look at how that works. So if I go to App Runner, we just go in and search for it. And this is definitely a newer service. And this is build and run production web applications at scale. This is a lightweight service. Here's an example of a microservice that I have set up here. And how does it work? Well, if I click on it, it's a full HTTPS microservice. What if I want to look at what's inside of it? Well, the way it works is that it talks to a repo in GitHub. In this case, I'm looking at a service called NoahGift microservice, and I've got a make file in there. I've got a README file. I've got hello. I've got a main.py. I've got a requirements file. All these things are pretty cool. They're built into the service. And the nice thing about this is this running a fast API, and it all does is do something similar to what I was showing before. It's an app. It's a route that adds two numbers together, and I have some parameters that do this. How do I run this with AWS App Runner? Well, it's very straightforward. All I do is I go through App Runner. I say I'll create service. And I have two options with AWS App Runner. I can pick a container registry, and the provider would be Amazon ECR. What this means is that I could build a container in many languages. Like, it doesn't have to be Python. It could be C#. It could be whatever language I want. And then I could deploy this service. Another option would be you just hand it your source code repository. It builds out the container. In this case, I've already got this connected to my GitHub. So what I can do is I can go to this container, to this repository. It takes, let's say, 30 seconds or so for it to, hook up to my GitHub environment and create a list of all the different services. I just scroll down to microservices. Once I'm into the microservices section, I could just take that and do a manual deploy, or I could do an automatic deploy. And what's really nice is, again, depending on what kind of thing you're solving, this could be a very effective way to build a microservice. We go next here. I just copy some settings, choose my runtime. It only supports Python and Node for the container-based deploy. And then I would go through and put in my build command, which could be just pip install my packages and then start it. Now, because I've already got this thing running, I don't have to do all that. I can just go to my other microservice and just take a look at the configuration. And the configuration, the build settings would be, it's using Python 3 runtime. I'm using port 8080, which it'll proxy to, which is really nice. I don't have to worry about, handling that. It'll serve it out via HTTPS, which would be port 443. And then in terms of configuration, what's nice about it is that it can go through here and be, serving out this API, and then also, giving me all of the things that I need in order to deploy this code. So really a great environment for me to experiment with, and really a nice service, right? So next up here, one of the things that we could do would be to check out what other services that we would want to deploy in terms of AWS. And what we really care about here is the last service, which would be Beanstalk, or the last one of two services, Beanstalk. What is Beanstalk? This is more of a legacy type service. It's something that if you have a classic load balancer based service and you want to use Node, Python, Ruby, Go, Docker, Java, .NET, you just go through here, say create application, build this out, pick which platform you want to build, again, Tomcat, Ruby, Python, whatever it is you're going to build, and then deploy that service. The other one that is slightly newer would be ECS, which would be the Elastic Container Service. And you would have to have a container running. Once you have a container running, then you could go through here and deploy a service using Amazon's container service. So you can see in a nutshell, there's a lot of ways to play around with things, going from simple to more complex. I think most beginners to AWS should focus using the Lambda, and then also using the other services on AWS, like the step functions. These would be great services to play around with. So that's probably a good spot for me to stop and sync up with on today. So what I covered today was just talked about how there's a lot of ways to get started with doing things on the AWS platform. And I would recommend Lambda. I would say Lambda and Cloud Shell are probably the two easiest ones to just start playing around with things. And in particular, if you can build out microservices using Lambda, it's going to give you the best running start for the AWS platform, because you can trigger events, you can talk to API Gateway, you can play around and learn the entire ecosystem, and then later make it more complex by hooking it into things like step functions. The other thing you can do with Lambda that we didn't get into, we didn't have time to cover today, is that you can open up their more full-fledged environment, which is the AWS Cloud 9 environment, and actually invoke things from that environment. Other languages like C#, you can use the Visual Studio environment and deploy serverless apps by just right-clicking as well. So there's a lot of great serverless support for developers using Lambda. The other one that we cover briefly is AWS App Runner, which is the microservice ecosystem. And what's nice about AWS App Runner is that it's essentially like the smallest possible microservice hosting that you can gravitate towards, and it completely solves the problem for you. So it serves out an HTTPS URL. It handles proxying things from your port to the port that's necessary. If you're a Python developer or a Node developer, really, really easy to get started with building microservices. So let's say, what are some examples of things you could build really quickly within a day? So, let's say you wanted to build a bot for Discord or a bot for Slack, and you want to host it somewhere. Perfect example of something that I would use AWS App Runner for. You code up, let's say, a 20 or 30 line piece of code in Python, check it into GitHub, set up continuous integration using GitHub Actions, make sure you have lintings, a little bit of testing, get that all working, take that code and hook it into AWS App Runner. App Runner will just take it for you. And then every time you make a change, it'll do continuous delivery, which is the concept of delivering that code into production automatically. That would be, I would say, probably the easiest possible end-to-end, fairly professional solution that you could pick on the AWS platform. So in a nutshell, Lambda, App Runner, those are two amazing services to experiment with on AWS platform, and I would recommend playing around with those. Now, you can also check out YouTube, the Pragmatic AI Labs YouTube, and I have a ton of examples of Lambda, a ton of examples of App Runner that you could take a look at, and that might be another place. So I think next week, we're going to wrap it up today, but next week what I'm going to cover is potentially a little bit more of some coding on AWS, and then once we're done with that, then probably the week after that, I'll dive into the AWS Solutions Architect certification and we'll cover a little bit more of the AWS Solutions Architect material, which is more complex than Cloud Practitioner. And then we'll do a little bit of coding. And then after that, we'll dive into AWS Solutions Architect Professional, which is one of the most difficult exams that are on AWS. And then we'll dive into that next. So see you next week at 3 p.m. on Tuesday, and talk to you soon.